I think one of the lessons of the SRS experience is that, alas, it is very difficult to coordinate the interagency from any particular agency or department, as opposed to having a robust capability at the National Security Council to at least drive the train. And also, not least, a willingness, which has not always been evident in this administration, and I worked in this administration, to have the NSC actually impose some discipline on the relevant departments. The fourth finding was that joined-up strategies for particular fragile and war-torn states remain the exception rather than the rule. This seems to be the case in the United States. I mean, obviously, once an issue gets as imperative as Iraq or Afghanistan, you're going to get a major attention, sustained attention with interagency strategy documents. What's clear, and again, Tom alluded to this, is despite the mission performance plans and DoD plans for particular countries, what has been lacking is sort of as a matter of course ensuring that the different streams of U.S. engagement with particular fragile and war-torn states aren't stovepiped, because unless what usually happens is until there's a major crisis and it gets kicked up to the deputies or to the principals committee, you actually don't get that sort of a directive to actually create real integrated approaches. And we make a number of recommendations in the book to ensure that in our view, that it's imperative to try to ensure that jointness occurs as far upstream as possible in the policy process and in the sort of conflict cycle process, because otherwise you're just always sort of chasing your tail. It's important to try to forge a common understanding of the strands of U.S. involvement in these countries, about the risks and drivers of instability, about the impact of failure on U.S. interests, what priority objectives should we have, what are the tools at our disposal, and what are the range and options and associated costs, et cetera. A lot of that doesn't really happen as a matter of course. The fifth finding is that Western governments have not really faced up to the resource implications of these new priorities, and there are a couple of aspects to this. First, few governments have created fast dispersing, flexible contingency funds to catalyze rapid response to emerging and post-conflict crises. And the U.S. again is sort of a glaring example in this. And SCRS, having failed for the past several years to get this $100 million bare bones conflict response fund, and you can contrast this with the ability of the Canadian equivalent, the Stabilization and Reconstruction Task Force, to get 100 million Canadian. I used to say that was less than $100 million US. It's no longer the case apparently, but given the rise of the Canadian dollar. But Canada, it's got a global footprint, conceivably 1/100th of the United States in this field, and yet they're able to get this sort of an arrangement. It's a bit ironic, to say the least, and testifies to the asymmetry within the U.S. government. More broadly, there is a mismatch between authorities and resources, where one agency possesses authorities and the other possesses resources. And you see this obviously in the United States quite strongly. In other governments, it's often the case that the development agency has a huge amount of resources, but its authority is sort of limited to what it can spend money on. So the Ministry of Defense and the Foreign Ministry are always sort of trying to grapple at this, trying to get a hold of that big pot of resources. In the United States, it's sort of a different problem. It's that there's this incredible mismatch between the ostensible authorities of the Secretary of State under the Foreign Assistance Act and actually the massive authorities available to DoD versus the civilian side of the interagency. Now, a lot of those DoD resources are spoken for, I understand that. But what this has done is it's forced huge laborious workarounds like these 1207 authorities that allow the drawdown of $100 million, for instance, from DoD O&M funds to support the State Department, and the civilian side is what they're doing on post-conflict reconstruction. Obviously, the other solution, less popular in Congress, would be to create some contingency fund and greater funding for the State Department to actually correspond to the Secretary of State's authorities, but that has not been done. The sixth finding, and I'll just go through this briefly, is sort of a basket of findings that are particular continued shortcomings on post-conflict responses. Notwithstanding some significant innovations and experiences over the past decade and a half, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, we still find some major shortcomings. One recurrent problem, which has been touched on a bit, was a lack of civil-military doctrine, as well as detailed contingency and operational planning that spans all stages of external involvement. This was critical to foster both a common picture of the challenge and then to facilitate mutual understanding and collaborative instincts across agencies. This lack of planning culture in civilian agencies is particularly noteworthy at the State Department, and I say this as a former employee of the policy planning staff, so I know what I'm talking about in terms of what we call planning is not what the military calls planning. During the Clinton administration, this isn't a partisan issue so much as that after 8 years there was an evolution towards this PDD 56 document, which was an integrated approach to contingency planning. Unfortunately, that was not continued during this administration, although we're sort of, again, groping our way back. And, hope to God that by the time a new administration of any flavor comes back, that we won't sort of simply throw out some of the good work that's been done. And Tom mentioned this interagency management system to govern the deployment of interagency teams, et cetera, and new planning processes that is being developed, and that's a good thing, but it's been a while in coming. Another gap, post-conflict gap, and I've just got a couple of more of these and then I'll be done. Another post-conflict gap is the continued failure of the U.S. and other governments to build up adequate technical capabilities within civilian agencies to design and implement essential activities in war-torn societies, as well as sufficient numbers of trained personnel who can be mobilized and deployed rapidly to the field, particularly in unstable environments. Now, as Tom mentioned, that the SCRS office has been working with its interagency partners to come up with different types of teams that could be deployed to regional combatant commands and also to the field. But this, the State Department is obviously still struggling to fill the modest number of civilian slots in PRTs, to build up the active response corps at the State Department. But one of the biggest disappointments is the failure to make any movement on this civilian reserve corps, which was mentioned by the President in the State of the Union address, but characteristically and reflecting the ambivalence that the administration has for this entire agenda, there was no budget line for it. So it's a bit odd to have it mentioned in the State of the Union and yet not have a budget line for it. It's conceivable that some of that will be added up by Congress. Some of that money, there's an attempt by the part of some legislators to ensure that there actually is some funding for a civilian reserve corps. But it's disappointing that after several years after this office was being created, the notion of what a civilian reserve corps would look like, how it would relate to existing capabilities, how it would relate to contractual capabilities, et cetera, has not yet been, there has not yet been an effort to ensure that that comes to fruition. And actually, to my knowledge, I don't believe that the civilian side of the interagency has yet taken an inventory of what the capabilities that exist and what the gaps are, a gap analysis in a sense of what they actually need. So there's a number of other things that I was going to say about provincial reconstruction teams, but I'll leave that because I know that there's about some of the sort of shortcomings and lessons about PRTs, but I'll leave that because I know there's an entire session devoted to that. The last thing that I will mention is that in general, the U.S. and other Western governments have failed to design robust, independent systems to monitor and evaluate the impact of SNR interventions in achieving their strategic goals. As Tom sort of alluded to, we tend to focus on how much money gets out the door, inputs, outputs, how many clinics or teachers, clinics or schools, or courthouses have been built, but we don't focus on the actual impact evaluation. And I would just say that the incentive structure, whether we're talking about USAID and the State Department, or we're talking about the host government, or we're talking about you guys, the contractor community, the incentive structure is totally aligned to avoid honest impact evaluations. And part of it's just human nature. But if you want to actually get decent impact evaluations, you actually need to have something independent, and you need to have it be constant, and you need to have it be real. So that we can measure the quality of justice, we can measure improvements in education, we can measure other things that are actually the impact, and that it's difficult to do and it takes time, but it's something that we need to get much better at. I will stop there.